Hello, everyone. My name is Wilma Erhard. I'm the Group Director for Health Economics and Payer Evidence for Respiratory and Immunology Diseases in AstraZeneca. Today, we're going to talk about HTA, Health Technology Assessments, and I will provide you with an overview. The questions I'm going to address today are starting with the difference between a regulatory assessment, a regulatory approval, which leads to marketing authorization, and an HTA. Then I will talk about what a HTA is and why it is needed. I will provide you with an overview of what an HTA process involves and how processes differ, because a HTA is not a HTA. It might vary from country to country. And finally, what you as a patient or a patient advocacy group can do to get involved in this process, because it in the end impacts you. Drug development is a lengthy process, and all of that needs to happen before regulatory approval can be granted. Regulatory approval allows a pharmaceutical company to bring a product to the market. And before all of that, we need to prove that a drug is safe and effective, so that there is an effect to the patient, and it's not too big of a harm, so that the risk and the effect is balanced. When there is the regulatory approval, we could sell the product. However, with drug development, you need usually get reimbursement for patients to access the drug. And payers who decide about the reimbursement of the drug, they need to know why they should pay for it. And this is what a HTA does. A health technology assessment comes after regulatory approval and will help the payers decide whether they are going to reimburse the drug or not. HTA assessment can differ from country to country. So in some countries, it's pretty fast after regulatory approval. Like in Germany, you have only a few weeks, some months, to get access to the patient. In other countries, HTA takes much longer, and patients can only access it after several years. Why this is the case, I might explain later. So, looking at this map of Europe, you can see there are several authorities all over the place. Regulatory approval usually is done by one authority. In the EU, it's the European Medicines Agency, and they are relevant for all countries involved. HTA, where you decide about money and whether you're going to spend for a drug, varies from country to country, sometimes even within a country. Furthermore, a HTA is, as I said, a decision-making tool. And the decision to reimburse a drug is also based on the political agenda of the country. So the political motivation, the focus, and the priorities within a specific country have a huge impact on decision-making. The example that I give you here is diabetes. So diabetes is really a high priority for politicians in the UK. So they provide access to a lot of drugs. In Germany, it's rather seen as a lifestyle choice. So politicians consider if you move a bit, if you change your eating habits, you can really, you don't have the problem with diabetes. This is not 100% true, but this is currently the political opinion. So a lot of diabetes drugs in the past have not been reimbursed in Germany. Having said that, so there's rather a bit of difference between regulatory and HTA. So the question now is, what is an HTA and why do we need it? A HTA, health technology assessment, supports decision making. And the decision here that we are going to ask is whether the health technology, in our cases medications, should be used or reimbursed. And to make this decision, a lot of evidence is considered. So on one hand side, the clinical effectiveness and safety, this is already part of the regulatory decision, compared to the existing standard of care. There are economic considerations. And beyond that, even a societal or an ethical impact might play a role. So, for example, if there is a preference towards a specific patient group, often very vulnerable patients like small children. Nobody wants to see small children suffer. The aim of a HTA is to inform the development of safe and effective health policies that are patient-focused and that seek to achieve the best value as defined by the decision makers. Also here, the highlight is defined by the decision maker, because that can change from country to country. A HTA, what we are talking here about, is usually aimed towards medications, but actually you can do a health technology assessment on any intervention within the system. So you can do a HTA on vaccines, on medical devices, on surgical interventions, or even how service is delivered. The aspects that are considered in a HTA are safety, clinical effectiveness, economic considerations, but also the budget impact. So the overall money I need to spend to provide this drug or this intervention to my patients. The organizational impact. Do I have the capability and the capacity in the system? Equity issues. So is it discriminating against a certain population? Do I want to make something against that? Ethical issues, feasibility considerations, also whether it's accepted by healthcare providers or by patients. So what is the patient preference in taking a certain drug, maybe an oral versus an IV, could be considered in the decision-making process. In summary, we have usually only a few regulatory authorities. As I said, in Europe, the European Medicines Agency is taking care of that, and their decision is valid for all countries. In the US, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, takes care of that, and then there are several more all over the world. And they establish whether the treatment is safe and clinically effective. On the other hand, HTA, they consider the entire benefit and value of the treatment, and that includes cost effectiveness. And I will further explain cost effectiveness and the content of that. Here you can see three major players in that field from France, Germany, and England. And as I said before, they all have their own processes. They all put a different emphasis on certain aspects of evidence, and they all make different decisions. So what does a HTA process involve, and how do they differ? First of all, who is interested in a HTA? The major stakeholder in that case, or the major addressee, are payers. And they want to know whether the intervention is more efficacious than any alternative, whether it's worth the cost, what they are currently paying for treating the disease, whether they can afford it, and what kind of budget they need to fund it. What are the consequences of not funding it? What is the unmet need for their patient population? And then also, how do they identify the patients who profit most? So is there a diagnostic involved, for example? But the payers are not the only stakeholders in this process. Also, physicians or prescribers are interested. And they have some similar questions as payers, so the efficacious The efficacy, the comparison against alternatives is definitely also here of high interest. Also, what do they need to consider? What do they need to understand? What kind of capability do they need to treat you or any patient with the medication? Whether it's tolerable, so the safety aspect. The unmet need definitely is also here a big question. Also, they are interested in how other colleagues are perceiving this drug. So how is it, how is it perceived, how it is used, what are the experiences, so this networking, the subpopulations or the patients who profit most and the identification of these patients, and also what do they need to do to monitor the effectiveness of the drug. And last but not least, another group who's very interested in this kind of assessment are the patients themselves. They first ask, why do they need the medication? Or what is the duration of the treatment? How long do they need to take the medication? What are the side effects? So even if it's tolerable from a population perspective, the individual still needs to answer for himself whether he is willing to take the risk of the side effect, or whether the risk in the individual case might be too high. What do they need to understand? So is there also something they need to consider while taking that medication? Is there also something else that is more efficacious, or is this really the best drug to use? What kind of support is offered for them to take the medication rightly, so that they get the most benefit out of it? And then also here, there might be the question of affordability. In many countries, patients also are have a copay or out of pocket, where insurances don't cover the entire amount. So HTA examines the value of a treatment, and that depends on the perspective that you take. And I've just presented you 3 different perspectives. So what is value in a HTA, and how is that reflected? So the population age is part of the assessment, the severity of the disease, the prevalence of the disease, the level of the unmet need, but also then the clinical value, the economic value, and everything monetary involved in it, like also some HTAs consider R&D costs or profitability, at least from a company perspective. This is a relevant a point of value. Whether there is available funding, and also price of competitors. So even if you're the most effective one, if someone is much cheaper and provides you with a little less effect, would you be willing to trade off that additional benefit to a much lower cost? And this is where we come back to cost effectiveness later. Also, what is considered is, for example, the social value, as I said before, or is the illness related to lifestyle? So should you insure yourself personally, or is the society responsible for covering your lifestyle choices? And then value kind of gets a different perspective. It affects yourself. So if you self have a direct value from an intervention, you might look at it very differently than if you only look at it from a more high-level perspective. Payers all over the world, they have different approaches to allocating healthcare budget and fund new medicines. So depending on what they focus on, they are asking different questions, and they have different decision drivers. So one focus might be cost effectiveness, and the examples here are the Anglo-Saxon countries, for example, the UK, Canada, Australia. They are really the examples for this, and what they ask is whether the treatment benefit is worth the price according my defined criteria. Then there are countries who look more into comparative clinical effectiveness. So is the treatment better than anything that already exists? And then in a second step, they first ask, how much is this improvement worth? And am I willing to pay for it? The examples for this is Germany, France, and Japan. So they usually have a two-step approach. First, a benefit assessment, and then negotiation on the price. There are also countries who look at budget optimization, like Italy or Spain, and they look at it from a total cost perspective. So how much more will I be paying to offer this intervention to my population? And then the follow-up question is definitely, can I afford it? And might I need to stop something else to be able to offer this medication, this intervention to my population? In countries like China or the US, the patient also plays a role in paying for the drug. And here it's the individual decision whether I myself or my family can pay for it. And then also, is it worth the cost compared to the benefit that I expect in my personal individual case? Generally speaking, we can say that payers make decisions based on a combination of 4 criteria. So first of all, they ask, do I actually need it? So is there an unmet need, or is the population, is the patient, are the physicians already satisfied with everything that already exists? Do patients suffer in a way? And then what is the clinical value? So what are the effects and what is the harm? What is the risk for it? Thirdly, they look at the economic value. So is it worth, is the benefit worth the cost spending? But even if it's cost effective in a way, they can decide against, because even if I think something is really valuable, its price, I still need to look into my wallet and see whether I am able to afford it. So the budget impact, the total impact on my limited budget makes the final decision. If I don't have the money, I might not be able to invest in something, even if I think it's really value its price. And how do they come to these decisions? So there are certain analysis tools that support decision making, and I'm going to introduce 3 of them to you. So we are talking about additional benefit assessment, about cost effectiveness analysis, and about budget impact analysis, and look at what the difference between these assessment types or these analyses are. Starting with Germany. Germany is a good case study for a comparative effectiveness for a benefit assessment. And Germany is a very well-structured process. It's quite transparent and you know what to expect when. So a manufacturer submits a dossier at market entry that is assessed by the HTA authority, the IQWiC. They conduct a benefit assessment. You have the possibility to react to this benefit assessment. And by you, I mean everyone who is affected by the final decision. So that's the manufacturer, that's the competitor, that are physicians associations, but also patients and patients associations. So everyone affected by the final decision is allowed to submit a written statement. Based on this written statement, you are invited to an oral hearing. And also the oral hearing, that happens in front of the political decision maker, so the Federal Joint Committee. And the Federal Joint Committee consists of both, of 3 folds, insurance companies, physicians and hospitals, and also patients. Patients are part of this jury, and they can advise they can ask questions during this hearing and then can advise the decision makers. They are not allowed to vote at this point of time. And all of that takes just 6 months. So after 6 months, you have the rating for the benefit assessment based on all the evidence provided. After that, the negotiation follows, but I won't focus on that because we are really looking into the benefit assessment. So, and what is considered in the benefit assessment? First of all, you need to have an appropriate comparative therapy. So what are you comparing against? This is decided by the decision maker. So it might be your comparator in your trial, but it could be also something very different. That what is standard of care or most used in this specific country. And if it's not your standard in your clinical trial, you need to apply a methodology called Indirect Comparison, and I'll explain that later. But also the severity of the disease plays a role, also whether it's used according its marketing authorization. So what does the label say? What is studied in the clinical trials, and how it is used in real life. What is the relevance or the meaningfulness of the studies? So they are looking into whether the patient population is applicable to the country, or whether the endpoints are considered relevant when the study was done. So all of it is the study results transferable to the situation in the specific country. They decide about the extent and the likelihood of the additional benefit. They evaluate the completeness or the validity of data. And this is a specific question, especially for patient-reported outcomes. So, for example, patient-reported outcomes who have a response rate below 80% are usually looked at quite critically, because you don't know why the more than 20% of the patient population didn't answer. Is there a structured bias behind because patients who are sick, who are in a hospital, or are really suffering from a severe disease might not answer, and therefore you're missing out a lot of information on this endpoint, in this part of the analysis. The relevant endpoints, also this is quite a big discussion point, because what is a relevant endpoint? Relevant endpoints in Germany are considered patient-relevant endpoints. So if the patient is able to experience the endpoint, this is considered to be relevant. If it's only a lab value or a blood proof or an image from an X-ray, and the patient himself doesn't know what happened, he is not experiencing it, then it's not considered in the assessment. Also, they are looking into the number and size of patient groups. So as I mentioned before, if we have two interventions, A and B, and they are studied in a trial, so A versus B, is A better than B, then this is called direct evidence, because you have a randomized controlled clinical trial studying one intervention versus another intervention. If you haven't done your clinical trial with the appropriate comparator, you might consider an indirect comparison. An indirect comparison works this way. So you might have done your clinical trial against a third intervention, and we call that C here. So you have direct evidence of C versus A. And for an indirect comparison to work, you also need direct evidence of B versus C. So if these two trials exist, they might not be in one trial, but two. You can use a method called indirect treatment comparison and compare these two trials against each other and get an estimate about A versus B. There are a few things that you need to consider, like likelihood of patients involved and time point and all of that. But generally speaking, this works. Furthermore, payers are also interested in the entire amount of evidence available. So what did other trials show in the same patient population? And this is then called a network meta-analysis. So if we have an additional treatment like D versus A, or E versus B, C, or F versus B, and you put them all together, you can come up with a pattern, or also look at which is the best treatment, what is the best effect, what kind of adverse events do you see, and so this is kind of the network meta-analysis, but also requires a lot of adjustment. Just for your information, in case you've heard this expression before. So moving on to the second possibility, or the second form of analysis, the cost-effectiveness analysis, and this is what NICE, the English HTA authority, is famous for. So how is economic value determined? In a cost-effectiveness analysis, you compare costs versus effects, so costs versus benefits. You look at the cost of one drug versus the cost of another drug, and you use the increment of that. So you use the difference between the costs. And the benefits you do in a similar way, though it's a bit more tricky to estimate the benefits. So you use, for example, you could use overall survival, which is a pretty clear benefit. So how long do patients live? But that might be biased as well, because they might live under not so nice conditions. So it was established to use a quality adjusted life year. So you also, and I explain you how to calculate that, but the quality adjusted life year is then also used as an increment. So you measure the quality adjusted life year in one treatment program versus another treatment program. So you use the difference. And you then divide the cost by the benefits, and you get a ratio. So whether the cost is worth the benefit or whether it's too high. So what is a QALY? A QALY consists of your life expectancy times your health-related quality of life. So just to give you a really simple example, if one intervention provides you with additional life years, let's say 5, in perfect health, then you multiply 5 times perfect health is measured either in 1 to 100 or 1 to 10. So let's say perfect health is 10. And you measure 5 years times 10, so you get 50 QALYs. Another intervention might provide you with 10 additional more life years. However, you are suffering under severe adverse events, or you have other symptoms. Maybe you can't get up out of your bed, or you're coughing the entire time. So your quality of life is decreased. And for simplicity reasons, let's say it's decreased by half. So you have a quality of life of 5. So 10 years of a quality of life of 5, when the most amount you can get is 10, would be also 50. So in that case, there is no difference between quality of life, though one intervention provides you with 5 more years and another with 10 more years. Just for explanation. And as you can see, this single cost effectiveness analysis might not capture what reality looks like. So cost effectiveness estimates are easy to calculate if you know the math behind it, but they neglect a lot of things. So, for example, what is the value of new treatment options when you don't have anything to treat your disease with? So if no alternative exists or no treatment at all, what if healthcare pathways are improved? This is not captured either. Is it the right outcome measure? What are healthcare priorities? As I said before, diabetes, for example. Patients and physician preferences are not considered. So maybe more how you are taking your drug, or whether you need to go to the physician every day or only once in 3 months, whether it's a rare disease, what is the patient population behind it, what is the cost effectiveness of your comparator treatments, is there a broader clinical value, also affordability. As I said before, intervention can be cost effective, but you just not have the funding to afford it, or additional considerations specific to this disease and treatments. So it's an easy decision-making tool, but you might not get all the information with it that you require to take an actual decision. And so how does NICE make its decisions? So they have 3 principles. The first principle is that they need sufficient evidence to make a decision. They consider costs and benefits, and they also consider the wider healthcare and societal impact. So there are more aspects to only a QALY, even with NICE. So how do they assess this cost effectiveness? First, they determine the costs and outcomes over a patient's lifetime. So both for the new treatment and then for the comparator, usually the standard of care. And then they calculate the incremental cost effectiveness ratio. Again, this is the difference between the direct healthcare costs divided by the difference in benefits. And this is called ICER, Incremental Cost Effectiveness Ratio. And then with this ratio, with this number, this itself doesn't tell you anything. What you need to do is you need to establish something called a threshold. So what is your willingness to pay? How much money are you willing to pay for something something new? So, and if you're new, or if your new drug, if your ICER is below this threshold, you approve it. If it's above the threshold, so if the costs outweigh the benefits, you reject it. To make the example here for the UK, there is no official threshold, but it's assumed to be between £20,000 per QALY and £30,000 per QALY. So around that value. So if you have an ICER of £15,000 per QALY, usually it's immediately accepted. If your ICER is more in the £100,000 per QALY, you can be pretty sure that it's going to be rejected. This was cost effectiveness. As I said, cost effectiveness also depends on the budget that you have available. And this is really then the affordability assessment, and you do that with a budget impact analysis. So just as an example, whether you're willing or whether you're able to pay for something depends a lot on the total cost. So you could have, for example, a very expensive drug, but because it's only a few patients and these few patients don't have alternatives, you might be still willing to pay for them because actually their impact on your budget is rather minimal. On the other hand, and here we can talk about diabetes, which costs only a few cents per patient per day, it's quite considered a cheap therapy per patient. But as there are many, many patients available, the sum of all of that together is a huge budget impact, and you might not be able to afford it. So the price for the individual patient is not really the decision maker for you, whether you are able to pay for it or not, but more from an entire patient population perspective. So what is the difference between a budget impact and cost effectiveness analysis? On one hand side, they look at different things. So they provide you with different perspectives in your decision-making process. So the underlying concept of budget impact analysis is affordability. In cost effectiveness evaluation, I want to know whether it's worth its money. And you use it to decide between the efficiency of alternative technologies. Budget impact analysis, on the other hand, they shows you the financial impact, so the overall amount you need to spend. And as budgets in governments are usually quite short-sighted, some you calculate only from 1 year to the other, also the time horizon is rather short, and you are more concerned about today's spend than future investment. And cost effectiveness analysis takes into consideration the entire lifetime, or the entire treatment, and the entire time a patient profits from a medication. Here as well, and this is taken into account by the health outcomes measure, so the quality adjusted life year, and this part is completely excluded in a budget impact analysis. It's a pure financial calculation without looking at outcomes. The outcome, or the result of a budget impact assessment, is the total cost, or the incremental annual cost, so the difference between what I'm spending this year and the difference that I'm spending next year. And for the economic evaluation, it's the difference per unit of health outcome achieved. So really two different results that you can use in your decision-making process. The cost effectiveness analysis, therefore, is also considered to have a broader perspective, so more a societal point of view. And the budget impact analysis is really who is paying for it, and do I have the money? Also, the population size is, as I mentioned before, is very important, because the more patients, the more budget, and the less patients, even if it's expensive, it might not impact your budget that much, and that doesn't play a role in cost effectiveness analysis. So, having said all of that, and maybe your heads are spinning about all these different types of analyses, what does the future look like? Because HTA is still considered to be a new science, a new way of looking at things, and it's evolving all over the place. It has evolved, and it will still evolve. HTA organizations in the EU are increasing in sophistication. They have developed dramatically over the past, and they are continuing to do so in the future. You usually try to figure out what are the levers that you can work on. So in the UK, oncology drugs have not been a priority over years, and oncology or cancer drugs are rarely reimbursed. This leads to the fact that oncology patients have not the same possibilities than in other countries, and by discovering this, the UK system wants to fix that by establishing the Cancer Drug Fund. So providing additional and specific to oncology an amount of money that you can use to reimburse these kind of drugs. It's also a limited amount, but at least it's really specific for oncology drugs. Also, real-world evidence, real-world data are more and more used in the process, and are even mandatory now in the UK. France, I mentioned before, was focusing on additional benefit, but also here they established a cost effectiveness assessment during the last years, and they want to focus more. So they have an additional perspective in their decision-making process. Germany is evolving quite a lot. They have been late to the plate of HTAs, but they are now continuing to develop further and further. And they, for example, there are so many reassessments of not only new drugs, but also requested by HTA, by the HTA agency. So there happens a lot, and you get a lot of evidence for decision making. In Italy, just recently, IFA updated their rules, and we still need to see what that impact is. Italy is also very famous or very dominant in the way of managed entry agreements. So they have a lot of registry established lately where you can follow patients and manage the entry or provide drugs to patients and select patients directly. But as unique as these countries are, they also collaborate, and they are looking at each other, and they try to copy or to implement what works well in one country, and they are learning from each other. And so there might be differences, but there's also a lot of collaboration, and this will increase over the next years, definitely. So NICE and in the UK and Canada, they announced collaboration, and they offer even parallel scientific advice. In the US, the Institute for Clinical Effectiveness, the ISA, it's the same abbreviation as the ratio, announced a project with NICE and Canada, and also China and Japan. They are looking at each other. The results from NICE have an impact all over the world. So authorities are looking, why did NICE accept, why did NICE reject? Also, what happens in Germany, that impacts sometimes in a formal way, sometimes in a more informal way. So having said all of that, where do you come in? So how can you be part of this process, and how can you make the patient voice heard? Because the outcome of all of these processes and this decision making, they impact you directly with providing either access or denying it. There are, in some countries, you have a very formal way or the potential to engage with the authorities. I mentioned before Germany, where the patient is formally involved in the process. However, in that case, participation is low because as a patient group, you can't decide on the actual outcome. You can only advise. In the UK or in the US, this is really a formal process where patients are part of the decision-making process. Nevertheless, in most countries, there is no formal way of engagement. But having said that, this is not the only way, because informal engagement might be as effective as formal engagement, sometimes even more. So the opportunities for informal engagement should be taken, and some formula that I can provide to you are these 4 bullet points in a way. So if you engage with someone in an informal way, build a compelling evidence base. So it's also for you interesting to look at the entire evidence that is available. So HTA can help you on that, and articulate a need for change. So why does this evidence available support the need for change? Unmet need, how many patients, how are they treated at the moment? So all of that can help you in formulating this need for change. Also the economic. So if someone is only looking at budget impact, it might be difficult. But really, what is the value of investment? So what is the value of investing in prevention or in controlled patients, like in asthma, and or in early treatment of a disease, and not waiting until it's really established and severe and you have a lot of complications with it. So here, making a good argument around the value of investment. Never underestimate storytelling and the human part of all of this. As I said before, if you are affected, you value something in a different way. So this emotional part, really telling decision makers what it is, how it feels like to be a patient, how it feels like to suffer from a disease, and what a different treatment, or what a treatment can make to your quality of life, make a different impact on you. And relationships. Building relationships, it's not one-off. So telling someone once about a new study is probably not effective, but really kind of investing in long-term relationships. But I don't think that I need to tell you this, because otherwise you wouldn't be here. So summarizing everything that I've said so far, a HTA is not a decision by itself, but it's a tool to support decision-making about which drugs should be reimbursed. And those decisions usually trigger patient access. As patients are not paying themselves, but through an insurance company or a tax-based system, reimbursement is the door opener for patient access. Reimbursement is not only based on scientific evidence, but also on the political focus on priorities, as well as how much money do I have available to spend, so the affordability question. And here, influence is quite possible, and setting the agenda and focusing or supporting politicians to set their priorities. Though formal engagement of patient advocacy groups in funding decisions is limited in most countries, informal engagement can be very effective and ensures that the patient voices are then also reflected in the final reimbursement decisions. So it's not something that is granted, but it's something that you can get involved in and also make a difference. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to take further questions and answers.